show. So if you saw me there, you might want to go pick some locks or something. It's pretty much the same thing. So my name is Jason Gillam. I am a principal security consultant with Secure Ideas. We do penetration testing, training, various different other types of security consulting. We're a small company, so we tend to just basically do whatever we can to help. Our goal is always to get to help our clients improve their security posture. So that's really our focus. I'm an IONS faculty member. Yeah. So I don't know if anybody works with IONS, but if you do, then you might see me at one of their forums. They basically have, it's like a decision support type of service is their main thing that they do. And then there's also consulting there as well. I've been doing some type of IT stuff for over 20 years. Too long. But I'm still here. It's awesome. So it's good stuff.
Give it another 20.
Give it another 20, yeah. I'm still here. I think I'm still seeing it. This is real. Okay. So things I like to do, I do a lot of open source projects when I have time, which is almost never. So, but most of them is writing code to break things. So, that's fun, right? If you're gonna write some code, you might as well write some code to break into stuff. So that's what I do. But a lot of my history is in software development. So why is it important for us to be thinking about security during or like it's from the beginning of the SDLC? I mean, I know probably everyone in this room really knows the answer, which is it's really, it comes down to a quality thing. Security testing is basically a specialized type of quality testing, quality assurance. So if we wait till the software is built and we put it out on the internet or even on the intranet, and then we're like, okay, we got this out here, time to sign up for a pen test, that's probably the wrong way to go, right? We all know this. So that's basically what made me start thinking about, well, how do we get this to work? Especially with all of the newer, cooler ways of building stuff. Agile has become huge in the last few years. And I talked to, a lot of it's actually through IONS, which is why I mentioned I was an IONS faculty member. I've talked to a lot of their clients in particular about their security teams are trying to figure out how do they communicate with these developers, because there's these cultural differences, right? We have developers, they have their timelines, and now they're going agile, so it's like, oh, I'm not doing documentation, I'm just going to build functional software, and you just have to figure out how you're going to test that. And on the security side, we're like, okay, well, I mean, it's great you're building this software, and it does all these wonderful things, but it still needs to be secure. I mean, your application has customer data in it. Right? It has sensitive information in it, or it's interacting with sensitive systems. So it needs to be secure. And so they're constantly butting heads. So you might have, there's different types of software development life cycles. Right? There's our traditional type, which looks something like, this is just a representation, right? So you have your waterfall type thing that happens, and anybody who works in has worked in corporate culture should probably very much understand that one and be very familiar with it. It's great on paper, right? It works really well on paper because you can go up to senior management and you can say, hey, we're doing our requirements. Once the requirements are done, the requirements are done. We have them. Okay, can we sign them off? Yeah, we can sign them off. We can send them over to security. They can sign off on them. Great, go on to the next step. That almost never actually works that way, but that's, in principle, it's supposed to be very easy to understand that way. Agile, kind of different, right? Because now we're in this cyclical thing. We want to do these sprints, typically on a big range. Some groups do them for like a week, 2 weeks, a couple months, whatever. But you're doing this, okay, well, we're never actually done. We're going to go through all of the same, basically, if you look at it, it's actually a lot of the same steps we have in the waterfall. It's just, we're going, going around them over and over again. So this is what a lot of dev teams are striving for. They're trying to get into this sort of thing because it's not just a trend. I'll say that right now. If you read into it, and I'm going to be going over the Agile Manifesto as part of this talk, so you kind of get a feel for what your developers are thinking. But it actually really does, in their minds anyway, helps them build better software at a faster pace. So most larger organizations especially, they have some weird hybrid of the two, right? They're not really doing Agile. They're saying we're going Agile, we're partway there. But they're still kind of really stuck in this. They have to have their toll gates, right? They have to have we reach this point in the development cycle, and then we're going to stop and look at everything and decide, do we really want to keep funding this project or not? So they want to do that. It's really, really hard to actually maintain a decent hybrid, though, because these two different life cycles are just so different from each other. They're opposite ends of a spectrum. So security in the waterfall, that's almost horrible, is really straightforward because we have these distinct steps and we know exactly where we're going to plug in. Okay? Some companies still don't have that much done, but it's easy. They have an idea of where they're doing it. So when we're building requirements, we send our documents off to security and they sign off on it. When we are doing our design reviews, we can have a security architect take a look at that, security architect or security engineer, take a look at it and sign off on it. When we get into implementation, we have tools that plug into the IDE that can say, basically they're quality checking tools. Like I said before, it's quality assurance, right? So they can say, hey, it looks like you are, appending onto strings and that there's a potential for an injection flaw here, right? Then you have your static analysis, your fortify and whatever that's going to look over all of your code, dynamic analysis, so on and so forth as you get into your actual testing phase. And then finally, you get your code deployed, you set up defensive controls like WAFs, you get your penetration testing done, and that's kind of how that goes, something like that, right? I know everybody's is different, but that idea of plugging all that in like that, does that really actually work in Agile? It doesn't really seem like there's a good way to make that just fit, right? It's square hole, round peg type of syndrome, right? So, Agile Challenges. So these are all common themes that I hear from frustrated security professionals when they're dealing with development teams that are just saying, "Hey, we're going to do Agile." Yeah, it must be a bad one. So, no documentation. Developers have decided we're not doing any documentation anymore. It's that big requirements document. Forget it. We're not doing that. All right. So so now I don't have any documentation to review. What am I going to do with that? No toll gates. So we're just going to keep doing this project until the developers feel like it's done. Is that how that works? And also, if the developers are building something that when you finally do look at it, you realize, whoa, wait a second, you're using the wrong algorithms there. You're plugging into the wrong system. That's no way that's secure. You've got flaws all over it. Do you have a way to actually stop it? To say, hey, wait a second, you can't move forward. This is broken. Daily meetings. So Scrum meetings, standing meetings daily. I don't know about any organization you guys are in, but almost everyone except for one. There's one I talked to that they actually did try to scale up their security engineers, so they had one per development team. I don't know how they managed to do that or afford it, but in most cases, that just doesn't scale, right? We have usually, depending on the company, you might have 100 developers and only 3 or 4 security people. You could have 20 or 30 teams developing stuff, and there's just like 2 or 3 people to go around to those. There's no way they can attend a meeting on a daily basis for each one. It just doesn't scale. Testing, every time we submit code, maybe. So I know there was the talk before mine started getting into DevOps and integrating testing on that. I think that's awesome. That's great. And how do you fit manual testing into something like that? So the Manifesto, this is the Agile Manifesto. You go to agilemanifesto.org, and I think that any security practitioner who's getting into a situation where they're dealing with an Agile development team needs to take a really close look at this and try to understand it, because this is what's driving whatever form of Agile your developers have come up with. It started with something like this, okay, these principles. So that kind of, you can get inside their mind and kind of figure out, where do they come up with this? What's driving the decisions that they're making to not do documentation, for example? Why does that seem so important to them? So I'm going to go over each of those, so I won't read them out right now. But basically, the important thing to realize is we value all of this stuff on the right over the stuff on the left. And that doesn't mean that you don't, it's my right, yeah. I just realized that if I turn it down. Stuff on the left and right, yeah. So, so we value these things over here, over these things over here. That doesn't mean we don't do any of these things. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means on a case-by-case basis, when we are making a decision on how to do something, it's going to put more emphasis on the side that we value most. Okay? All right, so first one here. We want to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Okay? So a lot of what they do is instead of saying, hey, we have this big monolithic process that we're going to use to build something. It involves going through all of these design and design meetings and whiteboarding all of this stuff. I mean, they still do some of that. They're not going to do away with it. But they're also not going to have requirements documents that are, this thick. So we have individuals and interactions happening as a priority, which really makes sense when you think about it. It's a social thing. So we've taken a group of people just like us who are known to be considered themselves introverts, and they basically made this decision of, hey, if we're really going to build stuff right, we have to do it in a social fashion. We have to talk to each other. And that's why they have forced meetings on a daily basis. So you think about that, it's like, well, how do we get security to work with that? We have to join the conversation. Right? You need to somehow get into those conversations. And make that, if you can do daily meetings with them, that's one thing. Hopefully that doesn't really come to that. But it does mean that you need to be part of that entire development process. Security needs to be part of it. QA is already part of it. They should already be, if they're doing it right, their quality assurance should be part of those teams, and they should be involved in there because QA needs to know how to test what's being built. They need to know how to test it now. It doesn't happen 3 months later when the code reaches the testing phase. It happens immediately, right? Right from the first sprint, in theory. But it doesn't mean we don't use any processes or tools. There's still going to be processes and tools involved. A lot of those are going to be there to assist with things. We don't lean on them. We don't rely on those being the only things, right? So the focus is on those interactions. Now, one of the ways they do this, I want to mention user stories, because user stories, for those who haven't seen them before, this is basically how we document and communicate things in a Agile Scrum type of situation, right? So instead of having this big requirements document that we try to update all the time, we have a user story. So the way the base of a user story is, as a whatever role, right? I want whatever capability so that you can achieve whatever goal, right? And that's basically how it works. So an example of one, and this is just some basic one I came up with. So as an admin user, I want to see a timestamp log so that I can see who recently modified permissions. Okay? And that's a user story. It's a positive story of a piece of functionality we're describing that we want in our product, in our solution. This one also happens to be I guess a security story, right? Because we're talking about a security role. So this is one of the roles, one of the stories that you might want to try to integrate into a solution that's being put out there. Potentially, there's probably a bunch of them. In fact, depending on what business you're in, you might have a bunch of security stories that are actually pretty common. You want them across all of the software development that's going on. So you need to get those into their process. They might have different ways of doing them. Sometimes people use software. Some groups will actually write them out on Post-it cards and stick them up on a wall somewhere. So you need to get into those. Another consideration, you don't have to do this, but another way to look at it, if your developers are open to this, is basically it's sort of like a negative story, a malicious user story, right? So what we're saying here is, hey, we have some malicious authenticated user who wants to see what's in the admin log, but they don't have the admin role, so that they can see who's accessed something or use it to gain access or something like that. So the way that you would want to present this is, hey, these are not regular user stories. These are kind of negative stories. We want to make sure that this is not possible, that there's no way that we're putting right protections in place. So the purpose of these stories is to lead a conversation. All right, you're not taking 20 pages of requirements and then saying, okay, well, let's try to boil that down to just one sentence. That's not exactly what we're doing. It's more to, hey, this is to lead a conversation for that time frame that we're working on this functionality. It's a way of noting it. And so there's going to be additional information that will be added to it, other conversations, other meetings might occur, whiteboarding, whatever. So,
would you say it is a mischaracterization to call those requirements light? If I have 50 of those in a sheet,
yeah,
those are requirements.
Yeah.
Right?
No, it's not. I don't think it's
not a long, drawn out.
It replaces the way requirements are handled.
Yeah.
And part of it actually goes into the next. So I'll go into the next one here because this leads straight into it, which is we value working software over comprehensive documentation. So using those stories, we can say, okay, in this sprint that's coming up over the next couple of weeks, we're going to work on these however many stories. Maybe you're working on 6 specific stories, and make sure that those work. All right, so we're going to incorporate those into our software. We're going to make sure those work. So that's kind of where that fits in.
The biggest thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
I work in this environment. The single biggest thing that the sprint-based flow does is, at the end of every sprint, you have fully working software. Someone's feature may not have made the sprint, but it didn't make it as a partial work in progress and holds up the release. Everything that's in there is done.
Yeah.
And that is huge for rapid iteration, and everything is releasable, even if it's not what everyone might have hoped to have been in the release.
We're at the platypus stage around on,
So we're saying, hey, we value working software over comprehensive documentation. When we first hear this, the first time we hear this, we might be thinking, oh, this is horrible. I mean, if you don't have documentation, how does anybody actually ever know what's going to be built? It sounds like you're just making it up as you go, right? But it's the software itself defines what you're building. Like that is the product that you have defines it. And the weird thing is that's really always been the case. I mean, when's the last time any of you who worked on a big waterfall project have had this, like, where they have all of the BRDs, business requirements documentation and all that, and the functional requirement specifications, and then you get to your end software and it's built, and then you compare it back to what was originally spec'd, and it matches perfectly? Nobody ever updates that stuff. Nobody has time for that, right? So although this is what I was saying at the beginning, this seems to make sense, and it's easy to explain to people to do things in a waterfall way with all of the documentation, but it seldom actually really works. Anybody who's been in software development for any length of time, and I have been in software development for a long time, I haven't been in recent years, but I've been through waterfall-based projects, and it's insane. how much emphasis is on the specification and the documentation and all of that. And it all seems to make sense while you're doing it. But then when you look back at it later, you realize this stuff doesn't match up. What we ended up building in the end is not exactly the same as this anyway. So there was probably a faster, better way. So, and this doesn't mean we don't do any documentation. That's kind of important. So you're still going to have bits and pieces of documentation. They're usually going to be somehow tied to those user stories. It's just not going to be written like a specification, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the ultimate disaster is when you have two systems. One's following the Agile, one's doing Waterfall, and they have to talk to each other.
Yes. Yes.
Well, that's pretty much like the security way of doing the security plans and the Agile.
So that was actually a very valid point. So the worst case scenario is when you have one group doing Agile and another doing Waterfall, and somehow they have to meet. They got an API. They got an API that needs to talk to each other or something like that, and it's chaos. And that's kind of what I was saying. Is it's really hard to actually make a hybrid of these work. You kind of have to, if you're going to go Agile, you pretty much have to jump in and do it. There's no halfway.
I had one system, one place. The Waterfall was all XML. And the test plan was generated from the requirements document. And it had to match 100% of the documentation wrote itself, and everything was a whole lot of comments in the code. It was traditional Waterfall. It worked awesome. It didn't look like, still like the requirement specification. It was like it was on the way to Agile.
You're saying it was pretty much auto-generated by a script?
No, it's not pretty much. It was 100%.
100%, yeah.
And that's a champ.
And that's where a lot of Agile and along with DevOps kind of heads towards, right? It's this idea that, hey, we're going to define all of this stuff, and as much as possible, we're going to start automating things, right?
The same solution would be true for Agile too.
Yeah.
You want all this stuff generated. You don't want to be writing any of this.
Exactly. So, how do we get the working software? How do we know it's working, for one thing? I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, it works on my machine, right? It's testing. Yeah. So as we're building the software, we're also building the test suite for the software at the same time. And Steve talked before this one, right? That's the idea. So we do a whole bunch of testing. We're going to automate as much of it as we can. That makes sense to do so. QA should be involved, and security should be involved in that as well. So part of that automating this, if you have security stories in there, it's up to partially, in some way, up to the security team to help figure out how we're going to test these to make sure that authorization checks are actually being done on every single call. There's got to be a way that we can test that, and hopefully there's a way you can automate that test, right? So that's really what we're after there. What am I doing for time?
By the way, the biggest thing people miss about automated tests is the freedom that you get when you find out, say, there's a CVE for one of your dependencies, and you can roll to production within minutes or hours, not days. Your QA team couldn't prove that this can break something otherwise.
Yeah. All right. That's a good point. So when you have all that testing in place, then making a change is less detrimental because your automated testing will tell you if it broke something. Right?
And automated testing is really awesome for security because if you test roles automated, you can see that a change in this role didn't affect the other role.
Yeah.
And that makes just a world of difference.
It makes a big difference. This one here, I think, maybe has a little less of an impact on security, maybe. I don't know. I keep trying to think about this one. So they value customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And to me, this sounds a lot like the first point, which is, this is really about interactions. It's about having a conversation. Now, security is part of it, part of the overall process of building the software, should be, but you're also, in some ways, a customer, right? So, I better hurry up, food's here. So we need to try to figure out, how do we integrate it? So how do we be treated as a customer and not as a afterthought? Because that's typically what happens in a lot of scenarios. Is security ends up being the afterthought. Security testing is, oh yeah, oh we were supposed to do that? I forgot. But it really needs to be part of, you want to be part of the overall conversation again. So, the other thing too, I think it kind of sort of is on here, is security, or the security party organization probably has a set of standards and baselines that have to be followed for various different things. And you can get caught in a bit of a, you're actually going to create more friction, I guess, if all you do is take those and say, hey, you guys need to do it this way, right? There needs to be a conversation there, and you, again, need to be part of it. And this, I think, really falls in play with, my talk isn't about DevOps, but this falls in with DevOps, where security teams should be involved in actually defining what that infrastructure is going to look like and the entire stack and setup on there, because they can incorporate those in, and you basically end up, your baselines, instead of being a document you reference that's sitting out on a portal somewhere, it ends up being actually defined as basically as software. It's checked into source control. It's something that you can actually make changes to in a change controlled fashion that's very strictly monitored and everything. So it's actually better for us that way. Okay, I like this one. So they value, for the Agile Manifesto, responding to change over following a plan. Initially, we're thinking, oh, well, we're not going to plan stuff. But you think about it, we excel at this in our industry. We're responding to change all the time, right? 0 day comes out. What do? Did we plan for that? No. We didn't plan for that. We work on the fly all the time as security practitioners. That's what we do, right? A lot of it is not really planned. So this actually should fit in really well with our own culture. So we need to take that into account. The fact that, hey, we're not going to decide, hey, let's totally plan out exactly what the software is going to look like and what it's going to do from the very beginning, and then hopefully in 12 months when it's finally finished, it looks like what we initially planned. That's not it. The whole point of Agile is just saying, hey, we're going to build this in iterations. We're going to make mistakes, but we have a method to address those as they occur, right? We're going to make changes. Our requirements are going to change. We're going to find out that maybe we start putting a couple of features out in our product, and then the feedback we're getting back from the people who are using it is, hey, this doesn't really work for us. We need something a little bit different. Can you change this? Can you change that? And you're actually able to adapt to that and adjust to it. And you adjust all of your testing accordingly. So how do we get from what we were talking about on the waterfall to actually work inside of our agile type of cycles? It actually fits in just fine. It's not really that bad, and I talked about those things already. So security requirements, those basically, we're going over the stories and building the stories and discussing them. So at some point, ideally what you need to be doing is actually getting involved in those discussions. And maybe that doesn't mean that you're part of those discussions every day. They have their daily meetings. But what you do want to do is you want to make sure you're part of those discussions as they pertain to any security requirements that are being built. So if there is a security story that's being worked on in that sprint, you need to have some representation of the table on that. And I'll address this now because I know this question usually comes up is, well, what if I'm one of those 2 security engineers and there's 20 projects going on? There's no way I can cope with all of that. So the compromise that, it takes time to do this, but the compromise that a lot of companies are moving towards for this is you basically have a security champion, per se, I guess, on those development teams. So it's something over time you get somebody who's actually on those teams. Usually you want somebody who's a little bit more senior, like architect or something, who's already involved in those meetings. Have them be the ones who are looking out for for security stories. So you kind of bring them into your fold and make them responsible for making sure that happens. And that can take time. It really depends on the maturity of the development teams and I guess the level of understanding of security that your architects have.
How does this work for not when you're making changes to an existing system, but you're building a whole new system from scratch?
You're building a whole new system from scratch.
Now you've got a whole bunch of business requirements, and now you're also layering on security requirements at this requirements phase, and the whole process will say, well, it didn't make it into the Scrum or the sprint.
Yeah.
Which, oh, I didn't need these security requirements, but I can leave out these business requirements.
Well, yeah. So you're still going to have some friction there. There's still going to be, at some level, somebody needs to make the decision. What's the priority, right? So, did you have something to add to that?
Yes, I do. You make them write a failing test, and launches can't happen with failing tests. So, for example, and start with the super basics. I mean, I could talk about this for 5 minutes, I'm not going to go there. But like seriously, think about it. Authentication and access control.
Sure.
Drill that. And then make them write a test that user A cannot access user B's data. That's not particularly onerous. And if you get that in that early, things move along.
It has to be, you have to get in at the beginning of it. So it can't be, hey, we're on sprint 20. We've been working on this project for a year, and then we start adding the security. Not going to work.
But at some point, the sprints have to be long enough to get the basics all done.
They
can't be a week at the start.
Well, here's the thing, though. So there are some features that might take more than one sprint to complete. It just won't be in the product until it is complete. And that's okay as long as your software isn't already out the door and being deployed somewhere where real users are using it. So it could still be, I mean, you could go through many sprints on a software project before you reach a point where you say, hey, this is ready for prime time, we can put it on the internet now. So that's pretty much how that works.
When is the data at risk? That's the value.
When is the
Any data that they're using in the test and development environment, they need to be protected.
Yeah.
Because if they're using live data in development,
oh yeah, if you're using live data,
they need to recognize that that's a risk they're incurring. So they need to front load those sprints and stories of tasks to address protecting that as soon as possible.
Exactly. Okay, so design and review. This actually is very similar to the requirements. Requirements and design, it all kind of flows into the same sort of conversation in Agile, right? So it's, here's our story, let's talk about our story. Okay, well, how are we going to build that? Same thing with your security testing on there too. You have your implementation. So at some point during this cycle, they're writing some code. Well, you can do your syntax checking and your code reviews as part of that. You should already be doing code reviews throughout your dev cycles anyway. So part of that code review, we talk about security code review as if that's something different or special, but it's really the same thing, right? It's supposed to be part of the same process. And this is actually another good benefit to having your security architects actually know security, or sorry, not your security architects, your developer architects, who are actually part of the development team, actually understand enough security so that they know what to look for when they're doing a code review. They're looking over it. It's because it should be your senior people looking at it, right? Making sure that people are doing things the right way. And they should say, oh, you know, where'd you learn to write database code? You just put a SQL injection flaw in here. So they should be able to know that and recognize it. QA. Okay, so there's actually something that's not on here, and I've been thinking more about it. But okay, there's static analysis, dynamic analysis, penetration testing. So you have your QA and your acceptance testing. A lot of this hopefully is automated. You can take your static analysis, dynamic analysis tools, and those can be somewhat automated. I mean, there's usually a lot of setup involved in them and rooting out your false positives and tuning and that sort of stuff. But ultimately, you can get yourself to a point, hopefully, where most of that is automated. So when a build gets, it doesn't necessarily have to be every single time somebody commits code that you go through, because those can be pretty heavy. But maybe you do it when a certain tag is added or something, right? But the other part of this too is, if you're looking for help on how to get more of this done manually, like more of the sort of manual testing done, QA, if they're already doing some manual testing, or maybe they're really tech savvy and they have they're using Selenium and automated tools basically to do all of their testing. If they're at that stage, you should teach them how to find security issues too. I mean, it's not that hard to show a QA person how to look for cross-site scripting flaws. It's pretty simple. The cross-site scripting flaws can be found through, a lot of them can be found easily through automated tools. And even on single-page apps, we talked about that last night if you were in the training last night. Even in single-page apps, if you have to either manually click through it or you're using a tool that can activate all of the JavaScript on there, then you can find, you can teach it to find cross-site scripting flaws as well. So that can be done. So recruit your QA people. And then, yeah, you get into deployment, and that part's the same. And I think the main thing that's different on here is, see where I have this evaluation prioritization. This is part of how Agile does things. Because they're thinking, hey, we're working in cycles. At some point in every cycle, we need to evaluate what are all the stories we have, what's all the functionality that we have that's half-baked, what's all the functionality we have that's ready to go, what needs to come next. And so there's these decisions that are made on a sprint-by-sprint basis. And so there's basically this risk ranking activity that occurs. So you need to be part of that because you want to make sure that your security features are high on that priority list, right? All of your security stories. The other thing, too, is you'll notice that what's different, this is also different in Agile, you don't find this in Waterfall at all, is at all of these steps, when stuff breaks, that gets thrown into consideration on that risk ranking and evaluation. So when tests fail, and you mentioned that earlier, when tests fail, that causes repercussions on the next sprint. And that's what we want. As security practitioners, we want that to happen. So as soon as something that's a security feature breaks, it gets back into that cycle into a way that we can deal with it.
Maybe people don't realize this. Community environment, it stops the deploy. If you're doing continuous integration,
especially if you're doing CI along with it, continuous integration. If you have a test fail on it, that's basically saying this is not ready to go. So there's that conversation we talked about earlier, where in Waterfall you have a way to manually, you have this toll gate, right? It's a defined. We finished our requirements phase. Now we're going to do a toll gate and make sure that A, can we continue to fund this, and B, are all the security requirements met that we need. And that's going to basically happen every sprint. So there actually is a toll gate. It's just not called a toll gate. And the toll gate is automated. It's when tests fail, that feature's not going to make it. So, and that can hold up the release. So some takeaways from this. One is, if you're getting involved with development teams that are doing Agile, don't become a roadblock. If you kind of draw a line in the sand and say, hey, this is security, you got to do it our way, which is a very typical traditional approach to it, it's not going to work with these guys. They'll probably ignore you. So you really need to join the conversation. That's what it comes down to. You have to collaborate with the developers. If you don't write them, at least think about the malicious user stories and try to figure out how we can get the developers thinking about the security features and functionality and controls that need to be in every single piece of software that they're writing. So, from the basics, how are we doing authentication? How are we doing authorization checks? How are we making sure that all of our data is in and out is being sanitized properly so that we don't have injection flaws and cross-site scripting flaws and things like that. Test automation is an ongoing battle. It can take a lot of time and energy and effort to make automation work, but it's worth it in the long run, especially if you're talking about like a larger project that's going to go on for a long time. Get your automated tests, because you might have to dedicate people to start working on those. And it's probably really a good idea to collaborate with, especially QA for automated testing. QA, some of these QA teams out there now, I don't know how many of you guys deal with them directly, but some of them they come up with brilliant ways of testing things. So we tend to think of QA as, or for years anyway, we've thought of them as the people who are somewhat technical, but not really technical enough to be a developer, so they're doing the testing, right? And it's sad that we think about them that way, but that has been a bit of a prejudice, I guess, in the industry for years. And the reality is their job is actually quite important, and a lot of them have become extremely good at it, to a point that they have stuff to teach us. So,
and that brings up an interesting point in that those people have turned into coders in their own right, writing the automation to do the testing.
Exactly.
Now they need another skill added to their
exactly. So in a lot of cases, if they are getting into the automation,
testing,
they've learned how to.
The automation.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So they've learned how to code. They've learned how to automate tests. I mean, that takes scripting skills, right? So. Triage your sprints for pen testing. This is really a thought on, if you're, again, in that case where there's 2 of me and there's 100 developers, you're going to have to try to figure out, come up with some way to determine when are you really needed. Because you don't want to be in every daily standing meeting. There's no way you can scale that. So, the security champion, I talked about that. Right, so get that architect or whoever to work with you. And use the backlog. I didn't really use that term earlier, but basically that's that prioritization, evaluation step. So as things, basically it's the list of things that still need to happen. It's a backlog, right? So as you go through a cycle, stuff gets thrown into the backlog, and then that gets not necessarily addressed, but it gets prioritized on the next cycle. So, and that's really it. So I think I finished on time for lunch. Good. If you have questions, I'm going to just let everybody go start eating, and then if you have questions, I'll hang up.